of The Gentleman Spy. How does Harry combine sophistication and mind-boggling fighting skills?
With a good director, really, and a good writer. It's, you know, I think that it's one of the things, acting sometimes polarizes into two different things you can do with it. One is that it's a mask where you can pretend to be the things you want to be. It's you go in the direction of your fantasy. It sometimes can be where you go to your worst fears and bear yourself at your most vulnerable and weakest and at your least appealing. But this was definitely the fantasy side of things. You know, somebody had written a role, dressed me up in the suit, give me the dialogue to do, and a brilliant team of stunt guys, basically all there just to make me look good. Yeah.
Sophie, can you describe the relationship with your character Roxy and Eggsy?
Yeah, I think Roxy is obviously the odd one out because she's, at the start, one of the only girls, and therefore immediately discriminated against. And although she comes from the same social background as a lot of the other guys, she's ultimately the weaker candidate because Kingsman is still quite an old-fashioned institute. And then Eggsy turns up, who she sees as kind of, definitely not what she'd expect or the others would expect Kingsman material to be, and through their apparent weaknesses, even though they don't see it as weakness, they form an allegiance together, and ultimately they just don't like the other candidates, and they support each other through that, and they're there for each other.
Slowly fall in love.
Slowly fall. That's the third one. You bringing that up a lot, Taron.
No, I think one of the lovely things about it is the fact that it is platonic, and they're mates, and Eggsy doesn't just see her as someone gorgeous, you know, or it just recognises that she has integrity and that she's a lovely person and that she's fierce and strong and able and capable, and they kind of both just bond over the fact that they're not sort of unpleasant, needlessly unpleasant, really.
Yeah.
And Taron, what draws Eggsy to undergo the rigorous Kingsman training?
Well, I think he's kind of, you know, feels a bit sort of lost, is a bit sort of disenfranchised, and Harry, this kind of enigmatic kind of hero figure, shows up and probably in some way, particularly with the connection with his father, neatly steps into that absent dad role and offers him this opportunity to do something constructive with his life. You know, Eggsy's a very, very capable young man. You know, he's said to have above average IQ, and you know, he's got all these kind of natural physical skills, and this is the sort of perfect outlet for them.
And what does Harry see in Eggsy that makes him think that he's Kingsman material?
He knows a lot about him. He knew his father. And there's an emotional involvement because his father died heroically, saving Harry's life. And it was due to a mistake that Harry made. So there's an immense emotional investment in that. And so I think he sees him as having to take on something of the father responsibility, but he also has been watching this boy grow up from a distance, and he sees this enormous talent and enormous potential, and he also sees him going down a path, as he says, which is going to end badly. And I think he sees a very, very troubled boy with a troubled family, and he feels he owes it to the boy to save him from that, and he also thinks he's the right material. He's been through the Marines. He's competed in youth gymnastics competitions. That's right.
Can you all discuss Matthew Vaughn's vision for the film and what specifically about it caught your interest?
Well, it's utterly his own, isn't it? I think he's. There's this paradox in Matthew, the way I see it, is a mixture of childlike love for cinema. I mean, something almost completely pure, just the fan, the kid who just wants to be enchanted and spellbound and have his mind blown by extraordinary things on the screen. It's as pure as that. And on the other side is something very, very sophisticated, a real... a very, very mature cinematic and worldly, informed sensibilities. So he knows how to conjure with all that, and that's. I don't think it's not always you can get that at high functioning level in the same person.
What's your favorite comic turned film franchise?
I think the X-Men franchise is brilliant. I do. I loved those comics when I was a little boy, and I had all the sort of duvet covers and posters and things. And I think it's just, I just think it's really elegant the way that they've, you know, started with the old cast, brought in these, you know, the new generation with Fassbender and James McAvoy and Nick Holt and Jennifer Lawrence, you know, doing the earlier part of the story. And I just think it all works great with the timelines, and I just think it's very clever and funny and entertaining.
Yeah, I'd go with you on that as well, because that's kind of what I grew up with, and I remember seeing it on TV as well, and like, being curious where it all came from, and they're, yeah, they were incredible films. Yeah, definitely that.
Yeah, same.
Taron, can you describe the relationship between Eggsy and Harry?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, I sort of slightly touched on it earlier, didn't I? I think it's a kind of, you know, Harry feels, whether, you know, rightly or wrongly, that he let down my dad during the opening sequence when he sacrifices himself to save Merlin and Jack Davenport's character Lancelot and Harry. And, you know, cut to 17 years later, and things haven't gone well from Eggsy. You know, he's got a real nasty piece of work living with him and his mum. His mum, having been a very, very, very sort of together, you know, well presented, but not dysfunctional lady, has turned into a really quite dysfunctional person. You know, seems to be sort of just really down on her luck. So there's a big gap in Eggsy's life for someone to come along and say, you know, buck your ideas up, one, and offer an avenue for him to sort of do something good with his life. So I think, in a kind of weird way, and you know, they kind of, you know, they kind of, it's a sort of father-sonny sort of thing, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey You Guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yeah.
Nice.
Hey You Guys!